long before angiosperms and even gymnosperms developed the ability to reproduce sexually via producing seeds, ferns had developed their own method of reproducing sexually. And ferns are still a very significant group of plants today, particularly in landscaping and other uses around the world. But in the United States, we predominantly use them for landscaping or for their appeal as ornamental plants. And so let's talk about how a fern accomplishes sexual reproduction. A fern does this by having two basic growth stages. It has an adult growth stage, which is 2N, okay? And this is referred to as a sporophyte stage because it produces what are called spores, and we'll elaborate on that in a minute. And then it has a reproductive stage, which is the 1N stage, and 1N meaning gametes, or being synonymous with gametes. This stage is called the gametophyte stage. The fern life cycle starts as a sporophyte, produces spores which develop into gametophytes, which when fertilized develop back into the sporophyte phase. And so we've got two distinct life cycles or portions of the life cycle. One is 2N and the other is 1N. All right, so let's look at each of them. The sporophyte growth phase of a fern is what we are familiar with as ferns, in that this is the full size adult growth form. Ferns are plants with leaf-like structures that are referred to as fronds, and a great many of them have multiple divisions on these fronds, or subdivisions of the fronds, if you will, that are referred to as pinnae. Okay, one of these is a pinnae. They're sort of like leaflets or subdivisions of the fronds. And on the undersides of these pinnae, we can find, in the right time of year, what are called sori. And sori are rust-colored. They are furry in appearance, typically, furry bumps. They're usually on the undersides of the leaves or of the pinnae. And basically, sori produce what are known as spores. And here is a photo of a mature sporophyte of one of the wood-type ferns. As you can see, this is what we would typically think of as a fern. Here's a frond with individual leaflets. This one is actually compounded twice. It's got leaflets, each of which have individual leaflets themselves. Taking a look at an actual sori, or group of sori, we can refer to this photograph. And as is stated over here, if you look closely, you can see these little rust-colored, reddish, furry sort of bumps on the underside of these pinnae. These sori, once again, produce spores, and spores are produced as a result of meiosis. When that means that they are 1N. They're very small and dust-like, and they're very synonymous with pollen grains and very similar to pollen grains, in that, especially in case that they are how these plants get moved around. They're very mobile, and ferns depend on water and wind, predominantly water, to move their spores around, and these spores are carried away. And once they are in an environment that is conducive to their growth, they germinate. And when they germinate, they form the reproductive growth form of the plant. So they germinate to produce the gametophyte phase. The gametophyte often looks like this. They are typically heart-shaped, and they will have their own little what are called rhizoids. They're sort of like roots that help it absorb moisture. But they basically are green. They're 1 or 2 millimeters in diameter. This is magnified probably in a 40x microscope. And they have a leaf-like structure. They are photosynthetic, but they're fairly short-lived in that their main purpose in existing is to strictly accomplish sexual reproduction. And they do so by producing both male and female reproductive structures. And the male ones are called antheridia. This should be easy enough to remember because we call the male parts of a flower anthers. And they produce sperm cells. These sperm cells are flagellate, meaning they have tails, and they swim away. And like I said a second ago, this is usually the environment that these germinate in is very, very moist. And one of the reasons for that is these sperm cells have no other way of getting around to find another gametophyte, hopefully, to fertilize, other than to swim. When they find another gametophyte of the same species, they will find somewhere on it an archegonium, which is the female reproductive structure. And it produces an egg that basically sits there and waits to be fertilized by a sperm. Once this is fertilized, a 2N embryo will then develop into the mature sporophyte form. So, quick summary, we've got our sporophyte form. On the undersides of these pinnae, they develop these sori, which produce spores, which are sort of like pollen grains that get carried away. When they germinate, they form these little gametophyte plantlets that will have both antheridia and archegonia. The sperm cells produced by the antheridia swim away and hopefully find another archegonium or an archegonium on a different gametophyte, which they can then fertilize to become a mature sporophyte form. And which, once it's fertilized, now we're back to a 2N growth phase. And that's basically how ferns typically reproduce sexually. So, without the use of flowers, without the use of cones, and even without the use of seed. There are no seed involved in the reproduction of fern-like plants.